Thank you, everybody. It's never easy going last, but I also I have the opportunity to pick up various threads from a very, very enriching conversation and a very, very pertinent conversation. May I next year be a tycoon when we meet next. So, very quickly introducing myself, my company Amplus Solar, we actually began as a startup in the year 2014. I think 2014, yeah, that's when we also set up a first power plant, solar power plant, 100 kilowatt plant on the roof of an engineering college in Maharashtra. Mr. Popley was at that time at IRIDA, if I recall. I mentioned the company because Mr. Razdan was talking about the participation of energy majors. Right? Ms. Gauri Singh talked about Total. Every large energy conglomerate has already invested in renewables. We are a member of the Petronas group. And we were their first international acquisition a little over 3 years ago in the area of renewable energy. So basically, we've become the learning platform for Petronas about how solar works, right? And obviously, their ambition is not going to be limited to, a company of our size. We are we're primarily a distributed energy company, almost entirely C&I. Our portfolio is 1.2 gigawatts. So the opportunity is absolutely phenomenal. One advantage that India has is it's got sheer scale, right? Whether if you look at the geographical size of the country, population density, or the overall population, we are massive. So, developing any kind of scale in India is relatively easy. Look at us, a gigawatt scale distributed energy player. It's less than 4 or 5 years ago that the utility players in my segment started to achieve gigawatt scale, solar alone. So we're really poised to grow. I will speak a little from the perspective of a person working on the ground as a corporate. We are not a development agency, we are not a financer. We're certainly not involved in policy, though my work largely, I know they said business development, I've moved on. I'm almost full-time into policy advocacy because the amount that you can do or not achieve is really the result of the kind of policies that have been put in place. With a federal structure like ours, it's a little more challenging because, we have 20 plus states, each one with their own policy. And these policies tend to get revised year after year. So the amount of time we spend reading regulations is enormous. That has opportunities, that also has challenges. So I know people pitch for one country, one policy. It is a very high risk one, because if that policy is unfavorable to, say, distributed energy solutions, that's the end of everything. Today, I can at least pick those states which support distributed solutions, which support open access, which have a policy that, is putting more into integrating greater amount of renewable into the grid. Before I go further, I'd like to state that in renewable energy, capacity means nothing. We always need to talk about generation. So how much capacity I'm creating in renewable energy is really a it's not a metric that I should be scoring success by, because there's a huge amount of idle capacity across the entire electricity chain, not just in renewables. And Mr. Popley mentioned that, the capacity utilization factor for solar earlier was in the teens. For distributed solar, it remains in the teens. It's now in the high teens. For utility solar, we have crossed 20-something. Wind energy seems to have crossed 30-something. And if you're doing solar wind hybrids, depending on how lucky you can get close to 40%. So it's all about generation, not about capacity. At 40% would mean something which is, 100 megawatt peak facility over a 24-hour period is producing 40. So it's all about generation. If we look at integration into the grid, nationally we are somewhere around 10% of the grid energy is renewable. We have a long, long way to go. Coming to net zero, very, very important discussion factor here. It's plus x minus x equals to 0. The quantum of x is very, very critical. You need to control the size of the x, because what scientists have found that despite increase in proportion of green energy, despite decarbonization. And this is not just true for India, this is true globally. The actual amount of emissions in the air is not coming down. So it's important, if I can keep that X to 50, to not let it get to 60, from the environmental perspective, also from the investment perspective. Because if my emission size is 50, my decarbonization effort also has to be 50. So I'm going to require less green to achieve a net zero. So this is something, energy efficiency or reduction, this is a discussion that we do not have as much, we just say net zero, but let's break it down and go a little bit more granular. The other request really I have to policymakers and to the audience at large, we need to have a paradigm, shift this entire narrative, and some of you picked up on it, on what is the base. As long as we're saying base has to be thermal for the next 100 years. Solar and other intermittent sources of generation like wind. First of all, we call them infirm generation. I take a little bit of offense to the term, right? Yes, solar will only produce as long as sunshine is there. But let's not call it infirm energy, right? And the entire pressure is put on the renewables generation to kind of, now you have to see how you can integrate into the grid. During the day, you overload the grid. During a certain monsoon season, wind overloads the grid. Why don't we relook at how the grid is structured? As long as we're going to, have this narrow path where we are not going to budge from, the base load has to be thermal, we are not going to make much of a change, because this entire integration of renewables into the grid will need, it's a very abused term, paradigm shift, but it requires that paradigm shift. We are talking about green hydrogen, and I am so excited to see that the government is also pushing green hydrogen, not just for domestic purposes, but also internationally. We want to be a hydrogen exporter. One of the reasons also we're looking at hydrogen is because if I look at solar manufacturing, supplying solar to the world, it's not this country. It's a very, very large neighboring country that has really become the world's solar supplier. Like the Middle East used to be the oil supplier to the world. China is the solar supplier to the world, be it modules, be it inverters. They have that market. How PLI and other schemes in India will work out, for me it's a bit wishful right now. If it comes through, obviously it makes my life as an Indian developer of energy easier, but I don't want to get into that discussion. Storage, again, we've got a little left behind in terms of manufacturing. And if I talk about storage cell manufacturing, we are not doing that at all in the country, right? But we very quickly jumped onto hydrogen, where it looks like the entire world is kind of on a level playing field today, right? So yes, so to that extent it makes sense. Where are we missing things? Even green hydrogen will require a huge quantum of storage to back it. How else is that hydrogen going to be green? If you're talking green from, being made by sources like solar and wind, these are intermittent sources. So either my grid has to be so robust and flexible that I can produce solar in the day, bank it in the grid, use grid electricity at night, and still be producing green hydrogen. Or I'm going to have to integrate storage even in the manufacture of hydrogen. So either both have to go in tandem. The grid has to become more flexible. We can look at even storing thermal electricity instead of backing down your thermal plants. You can look at storing thermal power in even lithium cells or whatever other technology is coming. The point I'm trying to make is storage. Hydrogen is not a substitute for storage. Hydrogen it's a different application, and production of green hydrogen will require either an extremely flexible grid or a lot of storage. So in my organization, we have committed to producing 2 plants of green hydrogen, backed by 750 megawatts each of renewable energy, primarily solar with some amount of wind energy in it. Just these 2 plants, hydrogen plants itself, are going to require 1.5 gigawatts of RE capacity building. If you look at my company, and we're probably the largest in our space, we are 1.25 gigawatts in 8 years. These 2 plants of hydrogen alone is going to be more than doubling our existing capacity. So it's requiring huge investment, but it's also going to require a huge infrastructure and supportive policies. The last couple of points I want to make, one really on hydrogen. If you want to export hydrogen, the cost of generating hydrogen has to be competitive. Let's look at the Eastern Hemisphere, you have competition from countries like Oman in the West, China, and Australia. All countries with very good solar generation and the ability to set up RE capacity. If you have 40% import duties, if your solar, and it is going to require 60 units of electricity to make 1 kg of hydrogen, that chemistry is not changing. So if you have a target of $1 or $2 per kilogram, you have to have a low cost of green electricity generation. And how your domestic manufacturing of solar modules is going to impact that must be looked at in all seriousness, because again here, countries that get the early mover advantage, that create RE capacities for green hydrogen, are countries which are going to corner the export market. The last point really I want to make on financing before I close, very quickly. Distributed renewable energy does not get any bank financing in this country. The only bank financing we have got is through a World Bank line of credit, which was earmarked for rooftop solar. Whatever they had earmarked for domestic, for residential segment, I don't think that has even been off-taken completely. The same is true for community solar, the same is true for residential solar, the MSME enterprise, all of them are completely behind. Yes, we may be achieving that 175 gigawatt number. Utility is doing very well in every sphere, whether it is solar or any other form that we are talking about of investment. Utility investment is where all the money is going. But at the lower level, at the distributed level, if commercial and industrial solar, where my clients are all A-rated large conglomerates, if we struggle to find financing, how are you going to finance community solar projects, MSME projects, smaller storage projects, all of which need financing? And it's not always integrated, right? Because some projects will be funding only storage. Some projects will be only about solar generation. Some might be about solar and cooking, something that we are not talking about much in India. But Africa is really talking about solar and cooking more from a point of view of the health benefits for people who are using, wood and other such material, which are very, very high emission in a closed environment of the house. So I would urge, all the policymakers, financiers, think tanks, and we have such a diverse panel over here, multilateral agencies, ISA, IRENA, to do a little more to percolate the funding, to not just look at the top line number of how many billions have come in, but to see that there is a more equitable distribution of that across all formats of renewable energy at extremely granular levels. So thank you so much for the opportunity and for listening to me. That's all.